The morning Sarah Chen found a dying panther on her doorstep, she never imagined it would save her life in return. What happened next defied everything wildlife experts thought they knew about one of nature's most elusive predators. The Tennessee mountains stretched endlessly before her cabin, their peaks shrouded in the pre-dawn mist that rolled through the valleys like ghostly fingers. Sarah stood on her weathered porch, a steaming mug of black coffee warming her calloused hands, watching the world slowly wake around her. 3 years of living in this isolated sanctuary had taught her to appreciate these quiet moments before the day began in earnest. The crisp October air carried the scent of pine needles and decomposing leaves, a natural perfume that reminded her how far she'd traveled from the dust and chaos of Afghanistan. Here, in the remote corner of the Great Smoky Mountains, the only sounds were the gentle rustle of wind through ancient oaks and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. No explosions, no screaming, no radio chatter crackling with coordinates for the next medevac flight. Sarah pulled her worn flannel jacket tighter around her shoulders, feeling the familiar ache in her left leg where shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone during her final deployment. The doctors had done their best, but some wounds never fully heal. Physical therapy had restored most of her mobility, but the deeper injuries remained hidden beneath the surface, manifesting in sleepless nights and sudden moments of panic when a car backfired or thunder rolled across the mountains. She'd chosen this remote cabin precisely because of its isolation. No neighbors meant no awkward conversations about her service, no well-meaning questions about why she'd left the army, or how she was adjusting to civilian life. Here she could exist without explanations, without the constant weight of other people's expectations or pity. The nearest town was 40 minutes down a winding mountain road, and Sarah preferred it that way. The morning routine had become sacred. Coffee on the porch, checking the weather, planning the day's small projects that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. Today's agenda included splitting more firewood and maybe fixing the loose board on the porch steps. Simple tasks that provided purpose without pressure, accomplishment without the life-or-death stakes that had defined her military career. As she took another sip of coffee, Sarah noticed how the mist was beginning to lift, revealing the dense forest that surrounded her property. This was her world now, predictable, quiet, safe. She had no idea that in just a few moments, that carefully constructed peace would be shattered by an encounter that would change everything she thought she knew about healing, trust, and the unexpected connections that can form between the most unlikely companions. A flash of tawny gold caught Sarah's peripheral vision, moving wrong through the underbrush at the forest's edge. Not the quick dart of a deer or the lumbering gait of a black bear, but something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist in these Tennessee mountains. The creature emerged from the tree line with an unsteady, labored movement that immediately set Sarah's combat instincts on high alert. Even from 50 yards away, she could see this was no ordinary mountain cat. The muscular frame, the distinctive coat pattern, the sheer size of the animal made her breath catch in her throat. A Florida panther, hundreds of miles from its natural habitat, moving with the desperate determination of something running on pure survival instinct. Sarah's coffee mug slipped from her fingers, shattering against the porch boards as she watched the impossible unfold before her. The panther's gait was wrong, favoring its right side heavily, and dark stains matted the golden fur along its flank. Blood. Fresh blood that left a faint trail across the fallen leaves as the massive cat approached her cabin with single-minded purpose. Every rational thought screamed at her to retreat inside, to grab the rifle mounted above her fireplace, to call the wildlife authorities. Panthers were apex predators, capable of taking down prey twice their size. An injured panther was even more dangerous, unpredictable and desperate. But something in the animal's movement held her frozen in place, her military training warring with an inexplicable instinct that this encounter was different from anything she'd ever experienced. The panther's amber eyes locked onto hers across the clearing, and Sarah felt a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with species identification. Those eyes held the same haunted quality she'd seen staring back at her in mirrors during the darkest months after her return from deployment. Pain, yes, but something deeper. A bone-deep weariness that came from carrying burdens too heavy to bear alone. As the distance between them narrowed, Sarah could see the extent of the panther's injuries more clearly. Deep gashes across the ribs suggested a territorial fight with another large predator, possibly a black bear. The right rear leg hung at an unnatural angle, and the animal's breathing came in shallow, labored pants that spoke of internal trauma beyond what was visible on the surface. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us a long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The panther stopped at the base of her porch steps, swaying slightly on 3 legs. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, woman and wildcat regarded each other in absolute silence. Then, in a movement that defied everything Sarah thought she knew about predator behavior, the panther slowly lowered itself to the ground and placed its massive head on the bottom step, amber eyes never leaving Sarah's face. The message needed no translation. "Help me." Sarah's pulse hammered against her throat as the full weight of the situation crashed over her like a cold mountain stream. A critically injured Florida panther lay bleeding on her doorstep over 600 miles from where it should exist, looking at her with eyes that seemed to peer straight into her soul. The logical part of her mind cataloged the impossibility of it all, while her combat medic training automatically assessed the severity of the wounds spread across the magnificent creature's body. The gashes along the panther's ribs were deep enough to require immediate suturing, and the way the animal held its right hind leg suggested either a severe sprain or possible fracture. Most concerning was the panther's labored breathing and the pale color of its gums when it briefly opened its mouth, indicating potential internal bleeding or shock. Without intervention, this apex predator would be dead within hours, possibly minutes. Sarah's pulse hammered against her throat as the full weight of the situation crashed over her like a cold mountain stream. A critically injured Florida panther lay bleeding on her doorstep, over 600 miles from where it should exist, looking at her with eyes that seemed to peer straight into her soul. The logical part of her mind cataloged the impossibility of it all, while her combat medic training automatically assessed the severity of the wounds spread across the magnificent creature's body. The gashes along the panther's ribs were deep enough to require immediate suturing, and the way the animal held its right hind leg suggested either a severe sprain or possible fracture. Most concerning was the panther's labored breathing and the pale color of its gums when it briefly opened its mouth, indicating potential internal bleeding or shock. Without intervention, this apex predator would be dead within hours, possibly minutes. Sarah's hands trembled as she slowly backed toward her front door, never breaking eye contact with the panther. Every movement felt magnified, echoing in the sudden stillness that had fallen over the forest. Even the birds had gone silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath to witness this unprecedented encounter between human and wild predator. Inside her cabin, Sarah's fingers fumbled for her cell phone, but the familiar "no service" message glowed mockingly on the screen. The mountains that provided her sanctuary also cut her off from the outside world when emergency struck. Her satellite phone sat in its charging dock on the kitchen counter, but even that would require precious minutes to connect to emergency services, and more time still for any wildlife expert to reach her remote location. The panther's soft whimper drifted through the screen door, a sound so incongruous from such a powerful predator that sent chills down Sarah's spine. She pressed her face to the window, watching as the animal's breathing became increasingly shallow. The dark stains in the dirt beneath its body were spreading, painting the fallen leaves crimson. A flashback hit her without warning.
The weight of a wounded soldier in her arms, blood seeping through field dressings, the desperate race against time as life slipped away despite her best efforts. The helplessness, the crushing responsibility, the knowledge that every second mattered. She'd sworn after her discharge that she'd never again hold another life in her hands, never again face those impossible choices between action and inaction. But as she watched the Panther's sides rise and fall with increasing difficulty, Sarah realized that some oaths were meant to be broken. Whether this was fate, coincidence, or something beyond human understanding didn't matter. What mattered was that a living creature was dying, and she possessed the skills to help. The war had taken much from her, but it had also given her something invaluable: the knowledge of how to fight death itself. Sarah stood at the threshold of her cabin, her hand gripping the doorframe until her knuckles turned white. The smart choice, the safe choice, was to stay inside and let nature take its course. Panthers were not domestic animals seeking human help. They were apex predators that could kill her with a single swipe of their powerful claws. Every wildlife manual she'd ever read, every expert she'd heard speak, emphasized the same cardinal rule: never approach an injured wild predator.
But the panther's labored breathing carried on the mountain air like a countdown timer, each exhale weaker than the last. Sarah closed her eyes and found herself transported back to a dusty field hospital in Kandahar, where she learned that sometimes the greatest courage came not from charging into battle, but from choosing compassion when logic demanded retreat. Her military medic bag still sat in the hall closet, untouched since her discharge. She'd kept it as a reminder of who she used to be, though she'd never imagined using it again. Now, as she pulled the worn canvas bag from its shelf, her fingers automatically checked the contents: sterile gauze, surgical thread, antibiotics, emergency medications. The familiar weight of the bag across her shoulder felt like putting on an old uniform. The screen door creaked as Sarah stepped onto the porch, her movements deliberate and slow. The panther's ear twitched at the sound, but it didn't lift its head from the wooden step. Up close, the animal was even more magnificent and more damaged than she'd initially realized. The muscle definition beneath the golden coat spoke of raw power, but the multiple wounds and obvious exhaustion revealed a creature pushed far beyond its limits. Sarah knelt on the porch, positioning herself just outside the panther's reach while opening her medical bag. The antiseptic smell that wafted up triggered another wave of memories, but she pushed them aside and focused on the immediate crisis. The panther's amber eyes tracked her movements with wary intelligence, neither aggressive nor trusting, simply waiting to see what this human would do. Speaking in the same calm, steady voice she'd used with wounded soldiers, Sarah began to narrate her actions. The panther probably couldn't understand her words, but tone was universal among all species. She explained each item as she removed it from the bag, her voice creating a bridge of sound between two very different worlds. The moment of truth arrived when Sarah extended her hand toward the nearest wound, a deep gash along the panther's shoulder. This was the point of no return. Either the panther would trust her enough to allow treatment, or it would react with the lethal instincts of a cornered predator. Time seemed suspended as Sarah's fingertips made contact with wild fur for the first time. The panther's muscles tensed like coiled steel beneath Sarah's touch, but the expected attack never came. Instead, a low rumble emanated from deep within the animal's chest, not quite a growl, not quite a purr, but something entirely new that seemed to bridge the gap between warning and acceptance. Sarah held her breath as she gently probed the edges of the shoulder wound, feeling the panther's eyes boring into her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Working with steady hands despite her racing heart, Sarah began cleaning the deepest gash with antiseptic solution. The panther flinched at the sting but remained still, its massive paws planted firmly on the porch steps. Each careful dab of the gauze revealed more damage: claw marks from what must have been a massive black bear, puncture wounds that suggested a prolonged and vicious fight, and older scars that told stories of a life lived on the razor's edge between survival and death. The satellite phone finally connected after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Dr. Marcus Williams, the nearest wildlife veterinarian, answered on the third ring, his voice thick with sleep, until Sarah explained her situation.
The silence that followed stretched so long she wondered if the call had dropped. "You're telling me you have a Florida panther in Tennessee, and it's letting you treat its wounds?" Marx's voice carried the skeptical tone of someone who'd heard too many impossible wildlife stories over the years. "Sarah, Florida panthers don't exist this far north. You're probably dealing with a large mountain lion or maybe an escaped exotic pet." Sarah described the distinctive features she could observe: the tawny coat with subtle rosettes, the compact muscular build, and the characteristic facial structure. Marcus's questions became more urgent as the clinical details mounted. "Keep the wounds clean and try to stabilize any fractures," he finally instructed. "I'm leaving Knoxville now, but it will take me at least 3 hours to reach you on those mountain roads." 3 hours felt like a lifetime when measured against the panther's weakening condition. Sarah carefully wrapped the shoulder wound, surprised by how docile the powerful predator remained throughout the process. The panther's breathing had stabilized somewhat, but its eyes were beginning to glaze with the telltale signs of shock setting in.
As she moved to examine the injured leg, Sarah found herself talking to the panther in the same soothing cadence she'd used with frightened soldiers. She told the animal about the mountains, about the peace she'd found in isolation, about the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. The panther's ears swiveled toward her voice, and Sarah could have sworn she saw something like understanding flicker in those amber depths. The next 18 hours blurred together in a haze of careful vigilance and tentative progress. Sarah had fashioned a makeshift shelter on her covered porch, using old blankets and a space heater, creating a warm cocoon where the panther could rest without feeling trapped. The magnificent cat had accepted small sips of water from a shallow bowl, though it refused the raw venison Sarah had retrieved from her freezer, turning its head away with obvious disinterest. Dr. Williams arrived just after sunset, his weathered face grave as he surveyed the scene through his truck's headlights. A man in his 60s with 4 decades of wildlife experience, he'd seen everything from rabid raccoons to orphan bear cubs, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of a Florida panther resting peacefully beside a former combat medic on a Tennessee mountainside. "This shouldn't be possible," he murmured as he approached with his veterinary kit, moving with the slow deliberation of someone who'd learned to respect wild animals' unpredictable nature. Panthers are solitary, territorial, and absolutely do not seek out human contact. What you've described goes against everything we know about their behavior patterns. The examination revealed more than Sarah's field treatment had uncovered. The panther was a young female, probably around 3 years old, with a microchip embedded between her shoulder blades. Dr. Williams' scanner revealed a registration number that traced back to a wildlife sanctuary in central Florida, over 600 miles away. The sanctuary had reported her missing 3 weeks earlier after a transport vehicle accident during a relocation effort. "She's been walking for weeks," Dr. Williams said, his voice filled with professional amazement. "Injured, alone, covering impossible distances through unfamiliar territory. Panthers don't migrate like this. They establish territories and defend them to the death. For her to travel this far suggests something beyond normal animal behavior." The broken leg required a surgical pin, but the makeshift veterinary clinic they established in Sarah's living room was far from ideal. Dr. Williams worked by lamplight while Sarah assisted, their movements synchronized like a well-trained surgical team. The panther remained unconscious under anesthesia, her powerful frame looking vulnerable and small on Sarah's dining room table. During the long hours of surgery, Dr. Williams shared stories of other impossible animal encounters he'd witnessed over the years. A dolphin that had guided lost swimmers to shore, a murder of crows that had led rescuers to a missing hiker, animals whose actions defied scientific explanation, suggesting an intelligence and purpose that humans barely understood. As dawn broke over the mountains, the panther's surgery was complete, and her steady breathing filled the quiet cabin with new hope. The panther's amber eyes opened for the first time in 2 days, focusing with startling clarity on Sarah's face as she sat beside the makeshift recovery bed. Gone was the glazed confusion of pain medication. In its place was an alertness that seemed to pierce straight through to Sarah's core. The magnificent cat lifted her head slightly, testing her strength, and Sarah felt her breath catch as she witnessed the moment when wild instinct began to reassert itself. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Recovery brought challenges neither Sarah nor Dr. Williams had anticipated. The Panther, who Sarah had begun calling Echo for reasons she couldn't quite explain, showed no interest in leaving the safety of the cabin. When Dr. Williams opened the front door to encourage her natural desire for freedom, Echo simply turned away and settled more deeply into the nest of blankets Sarah had arranged near the fireplace. The behavior baffled the veterinarian, who'd expected the cat to bolt for the forest the moment her strength returned. "She's imprinted on you somehow," Dr. Williams observed during one of his daily checkups, scratching his graying beard in bewilderment. "In 40 years of wildlife rehabilitation, I've never seen anything like this. She follows you with her eyes, relaxes when you speak, even seems to time her movements to match yours. It's as if she's chosen you as her pack." The strange partnership that developed over the following weeks defied every principle of wildlife biology. Echo would accept food only when Sarah offered it, refuse medication unless Sarah administered it personally, and showed signs of distress whenever Sarah left the cabin for extended periods. More remarkably, the Panther seemed to understand Sarah's emotional states with uncanny accuracy, becoming more alert during Sarah's nightmares and positioning herself closer during the dark moments when combat memories threatened to overwhelm. Sarah found herself talking to Echo about things she'd never shared with therapists or fellow veterans. The weight of lives lost under her care in Afghanistan, the crushing guilt over surviving when others hadn't, the isolation that had driven her to these remote mountains in search of peace that always seemed just out of reach. Echo listened with the patience of a trained counselor, her amber eyes reflecting a wisdom that transcended species boundaries. The breakthrough came during a particularly violent thunderstorm that sent Sarah spiraling into a panic attack. As lightning split the sky and thunder shook the cabin's foundation, Sarah curled into a ball on her kitchen floor, transported back to mortar attacks and exploding IEDs. Echo rose from her bed despite her healing injuries and approached slowly, settling her massive frame against Sarah's trembling body. The warmth and steady heartbeat of the Panther became an anchor to the present moment, pulling Sarah back from the abyss of traumatic memory. For the first time since her discharge, Sarah slept through an entire night without waking in a cold sweat. 6 weeks after Echo's arrival, the inevitable conversation arrived with Dr. Williams's morning visit. The Panther had healed beyond all expectations, her surgical site showing no signs of infection and her mobility returning to near-normal levels. The time had come to discuss Echo's future, and Sarah felt her stomach clench with the familiar dread she'd hoped never to experience again. "She can't stay here permanently," Dr. Williams said gently, his weathered hands checking Echo's leg one final time. "She's a wild animal, Sarah. Despite this extraordinary bond you've formed, she needs to be with her own kind. The Florida Sanctuary has been asking about her recovery, and they're prepared to transport her back as soon as I clear her for travel." Echo seemed to sense the tension in the room, her amber eyes moving between the two humans with an intelligence that made Sarah's chest tighten. The Panther had learned to read human emotions with startling accuracy, and now she pressed closer to Sarah's side, a warm, reassuring presence that had become as essential as breathing. The thought of losing Echo felt like tearing open wounds that had finally begun to heal. For 6 weeks, Sarah had experienced something she'd thought lost forever: purpose beyond mere survival. Caring for Echo had given structure to her days, meaning to her isolation, and a reason to look forward to tomorrow. The Panther had become more than a patient or even a companion. She'd become a bridge back to the person Sarah used to be before the war changed everything. But Sarah also understood the weight of responsibility that came with loving something wild. Echo deserved more than the confines of a mountain cabin, no matter how comfortable she'd become. She needed space to run, to hunt, to be the apex predator nature had designed her to be. Keeping her here would be an act of selfishness disguised as love. The decision crystallized during Echo's final night in the cabin. As Sarah sat beside the fireplace, watching the panther stretch and pace with renewed strength, she recognized the restless energy of a creature ready to reclaim her place in the world. Echo's injured leg barely showed a limp now, and her eyes held a brightness that spoke of healing that went far deeper than physical wounds. "You saved my life, you know," Sarah whispered, her fingers gently stroking the soft fur behind Echo's ears. "Now I need to save yours by letting you go." Echo turned to look at her with those impossibly expressive amber eyes, and Sarah could have sworn she saw understanding pass between them. Tomorrow the transport vehicle would arrive to take Echo back to Florida, back to the wild sanctuary where she belonged. Build. Dr. Santos lowered the tranquilizer gun, her expression thoughtful as she observed the unusual dynamic between woman and panther. "In my 15 years of wildlife transport, I've never encountered anything like this," she admitted. "Usually, recovered animals are eager to return to their natural habitat. She's bonded to you in a way that contradicts everything we know about panther behavior." The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Williams suggested that Sarah accompany Echo during the initial phase of the transport, riding in the vehicle until they reached the halfway point, where Echo would need to adjust to traveling without her human companion. It was an unprecedented arrangement, but the panther's welfare took priority over standard protocols. The journey south through Tennessee and into Georgia passed in tense silence. Echo remained calm as long as Sarah's hand rested against the transport crate, but became agitated whenever Sarah moved away. Through the ventilation slots, Sarah could see those intelligent amber eyes tracking her every movement, seeking reassurance in an increasingly uncertain world. At the planned rest stop in Macon, Georgia, the moment of final separation arrived. Sarah knelt beside the transport crate, her fingers intertwined with Echo's massive paw through the mesh opening. The panther's rumbling purr vibrated through the metal, a sound Sarah had learned to interpret as contentment mixed with trust. "This isn't goodbye," Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring Echo or herself. "This is you going home to become who you were meant to be." Echo's response was a gentle head bump against Sarah's palm, followed by the softest of chuffs. Then, remarkably, the panther settled into the back of her crate and closed her eyes, as if finally accepting her destiny. 2 months later, Sarah received a call that changed everything. Dr. Santos's voice crackled through the satellite phone connection, barely containing her excitement. "Sarah, you need to see this. Echo has done something unprecedented at the sanctuary." The video link revealed Echo in her spacious enclosure, but she wasn't alone. 3 other rescued panthers, all previous loners who'd never shown interest in social interaction, had formed an unlikely group around her. Echo had somehow become a therapy animal for other traumatized wildlife, teaching them to trust again through her own example of healing. "She's become a therapy animal for other traumatized wildlife," Dr. Santos explained. "We've never seen anything like it. Panthers that were considered beyond rehabilitation are now thriving because of her influence." But the most remarkable discovery came when sanctuary cameras captured Echo's nighttime behavior. Each evening, she would position herself at the observation window facing north, sitting in the exact posture Sarah remembered from their cabin nights together. She was looking toward Tennessee, toward the mountains where her healing had begun. Sarah made her decision that afternoon. Using her military disability benefits and savings, she enrolled in a wildlife rehabilitation certification program. 6 months later, she joined the sanctuary staff as their first ever veteran counselor, working with both animals and fellow veterans struggling with PTSD. Echo's story had come full circle. The panther who'd traveled impossible distances to find healing had taught a broken soldier that sometimes the greatest journeys aren't about moving forward, but about finding the courage to trust again. Their reunion was captured on sanctuary cameras. A woman and a panther, both forever changed by an encounter that proved love truly knows no boundaries. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of healing, hope, and the extraordinary connections that bind all living beings together. Your support helps us share these amazing stories with the world.